Dr. John Alderdice, could I ask you first of all, it's not a question that's necessarily easily or briefly answered, why did you become a politician? How did you become a politician?
You're right, it's not easy to answer. I've always been interested in politics, and it was something that I took a great deal of pleasure in discussing and thinking about and reading about. But for someone with my background, it wasn't practical to become involved in politics up front. Until one had some kind of career. And so I went along, did my medical studies and so on, and once that was completed, felt myself a little bit more free to become involved in things. And then, as it is with something you're interested in, once you get involved, it begins to take over.
Why the Alliance Party?
Well, when I came to near the end of my medical studies, I actually wrote to all the constitutional political parties in Northern Ireland, and I got back material from them and read them through. And it wasn't a very difficult decision, because I found that the kinds of things which were important for me were the kinds of things that the Alliance Party stood for. So it wasn't a very difficult decision in that sense.
Well, will you explain to those people who look very sceptically at the position of the Alliance Party vis-a-vis the reality on the ground of life in Northern Ireland? What is the relevance of the Alliance Party?
I suppose there are two sides to it. First of all, in any community, there are those who hold to a liberal, democratic, radical line in politics, and that's a line of politics which is represented in virtually every community. But in the Northern Ireland situation, it's particularly important, and not only does it represent that side of politics, but it also represents the whole movement towards reconciliation and a bringing together of the community. Now, it's true that we represent perhaps something around about 10% of the electorate, which isn't enormous, but in a divided community, those who hold the bridgehead of reconciliation are an absolutely crucial factor. And there have been a number of times during the past 20 years when the position of the Alliance Party has been absolutely vital in holding a community back from the abyss of civil war.
It has actually, genuinely, you feel, by its very existence, prevented a civil war in Northern Ireland?
I've absolutely no doubt about that.
How?
Let me give you one example. After the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, there was a threat from some of the Protestant politicians that they would make Northern Ireland ungovernable, for example. They withdrew from all kinds of elected bodies. They tried to create difficulties and trouble of all kinds. Now, the position that the Alliance Party took was that with all our reservations about the agreement and the way it came about, nevertheless it was there. And making a country ungovernable was a recipe for anarchy, not political progress. And so we gave backing to the police, we gave support to the government, and when it came to the only parts of democracy that were left, the local authorities, we took the loyalist politicians to court to force them to get back into making local government work. And in fact, nobody else was prepared to do that. Nobody else took their courage in their hand and did it. And the party did. Individual members took them to court at great risk and at great cost, financially and in personal terms. And what that did was got people back into working local democracy at some level. It was a long, difficult haul, but it did make that difference. That's just one example of how it has had a major impact. But there are many others as well.
Well, I want to return to the politics and the life of Northern Ireland later on, but going back to your own beginnings, your father was and is a Presbyterian minister in Ballymena. What exactly, for people who really don't know what Presbyterianism is, can you tell us what it is? What is a Presbyterian?
Presbyterianism really grew out of the whole Reformation movement on the continent. It really began in Geneva with John Calvin, I suppose. And the basic principles were that rather than the church and the traditions of the church being the final arbiter of someone's conscience, it was the scriptures of the Old and New Testament as interpreted by one's individual conscience. Now, that didn't mean that the church and the traditions of the church had no relevance, but they were not a final arbiter. And therefore there's an enormously liberal, radical, individualist approach. It's the individual's conscience which is primary in the interpretation of the scriptures, though never to be set above the scriptures. Now that means that in terms of the doctrine of the church, and of course in the government of the church, there's a very democratic feel to things, so that, for example, the decision about which minister comes to a church comes about by an election amongst the people. Those who run the church are elders who are elected by the congregation. So it's a very democratic form of church government, and this has very strong qualities because it ensures a democratic approach. It also has the problem that those who sometimes might be going a little beyond what people might wish will find themselves held back in check sometimes by the people who are often not so much in the forefront. People are generally conservative as a body.
Well, now your father imbued you with that kind of liberalism that you're talking about, which led you down the ecumenical road. This was not that usual. In this he was unusual, was he not?
Yes, I think that's probably true. What he did always try to encourage was a questioning spirit, an attempt to put oneself under scrutiny and ask the questions, play devil's advocate with oneself and see was one being rigorous and honest. Secondly, I think there was something he very, very frequently quoted, which comes from the Westminster Confession of Faith, was that one must refuse light from no quarter. And therefore he would keep saying, well now, we may not agree with Roman Catholics on some things, but there are some things that we should and must learn from them. He had a very internationalist spirit. He enjoyed travelling and helping us to travel. And so I think it would be an understanding of oikoumene in the best sense, that the whole world, none of it could be dismissed. No people could be put to the side. They were all there and all valuable.
Yet he did put aside one group, and that was the Orange Lodge. He had nothing to do with them.
He didn't have anything to do with them. I don't suppose there was a profound antipathy towards them, but I think he felt very much that the ideals which were set out of a protection of civil and religious liberty weren't necessarily lived out. And I don't think that he felt very much that by being involved with that he would be able to forward those aims which he undoubtedly held very strongly for himself.
You said that your father and every Presbyterian minister, because of the democratic nature of their election to office, have to watch themselves very carefully so that they don't, shall we say, get ahead of their flock. Does it not also mean that if they do, they lose their flock to, let us say, the perfect example is the Free Presbyterian Church, as it's called, Ian Paisley's church?
I think there is a danger of that, yes.
It's happened a lot.
I do believe you're right. I think it has happened. It has happened within the church. It's happened within political life between the official unionists and the democratic unionists. It's happened in church life between the Presbyterians and the Free Presbyterians. I think it's important for people to realize that the Free Presbyterian Church, however, didn't grow out of the Presbyterian Church. Paisley's background was amongst the Baptists and the Brethren, quite closed, fairly fundamentalist groups. And though he took many members from the Presbyterian Church, they didn't come originally from Presbyterianism. But you're right, it did create a certain anxiety. And I think that that was the big failing. Instead of having the courage of one's convictions and saying, whether people agree with me, whether they don't, I'm standing in this, I believe that this is the way to go forward, which is, after all, the classic reformer stance. Here I stand, I can do no other. There was a tendency to say, well, you know, if we go down this line, what are people going to think? And when that happens, inevitably, it leads to anxiety and fear, a loss of direction, and in reality, a loss of membership, because people then say, well, you don't know what you're standing for, and they move away. So I think there has been that danger.
And what about the position that Ian Paisley occupies, and has occupied for a long time? That is also, in a political sense, circumscribed by this business of having to look to the flock all the time. Even if he wanted to make ecumenical gestures or gestures towards the sharing of power, are you saying it would be impossible for him?
I think it would be extraordinarily difficult. I wouldn't like to suggest that he would want to make ecumenical gestures, because I don't think that that's true.
Well, I meant in the political sense.
In political terms, I think there is a part of him that would like to be a practical politician. But his power base is not political, it is religious. It's in the Free Presbyterian Church, which is a very fundamentalist body of people who are not actually particularly interested in political power. They're interested in standing for what they happen to believe. I would take it to be a very rigid kind of structure and doctrine. And therefore, they don't have an interest in following a practical political line. This is creating great struggles within the Democratic Unionist Party between those who are basically Free Presbyterians and those who are relatively younger, perhaps, a little bit better educated, pragmatic politicians who might be prepared to move towards some kind of accommodation for the rewards that it would bring. But I think you're right. I think that's a very reasonable observation that he is actually held back and stuck there.
Well, now, coming back from his to your church, you quote A.T.Q. Stewart as saying that a Presbyterian is at his most comfortable when he's being radical. I don't know when this was written, but could I put it to you that it's no longer true of a majority of Presbyterians in the north of Ireland? They've grown conservative, indeed reactionary.
I think that there's a good deal of truth in that. I'm not, however, entirely convinced that that tremendously rich strand has disappeared. And I must say that in looking round, I see evidences of that beginning to come to the fore again, that there is a looking back to times when there was a more liberal, radical, tolerant spirit, and people saying, what did we do? Why did we lose that? We lost something very important. Let's look back at it. And of course, we're coming round to the 200th anniversary of the times which have in Belfast and in Irish history really become almost mythical. And I think there is a beginning of a looking back to that and saying, what have we lost? You know, we have become the conservatives. It often happens to revolutionaries, though, doesn't it?
Of course,
they become the conservatives of the next generation.
Can you answer the question that they're asking themselves? What did happen to them? Why have they become solid, comfortable, and unquestioning?
I don't think they've become comfortable, and I don't know that they've become unquestioning, but I think what did happen was they became very frightened. They turned in upon themselves, and because they were in the majority, which is almost always a dreadfully dangerous position for a radical, once you're in the majority, you are no longer a dissenter. You are becoming part of the establishment, and your whole raison d'etre begins to disappear. But interestingly, within a majority within Northern Ireland, or within Ulster, but a minority within Ireland, it created this strange kind of situation. In some ways, you know, the reaction to the Anglo-Irish Agreement represents that. On the one side, there's a reprehensible part of that reaction, which is the wish to return to an ascendancy, to an oppressing of a minority, and so on. And that's reprehensible. There is another side which says it is fundamentally wrong to impose a form of government on any people without their consultation and without their will. And it's hard to dispute the truth of that.
Isn't that what happened to Catholics for 60 years? Isn't that why the trouble is there now? Isn't that precisely what was done?
And it's very interesting, the reaction. Recently, Sammy Wilson said that one of the good things that had come out of the Anglo-Irish Agreement was that Protestants in Northern Ireland now began to realise at a personal experiential level what they had been doing to Catholics in Northern Ireland for the past 60 years. So, yes, I think you're quite right. And maybe it has begun to have a useful effect in that sense. Certainly, if one takes what he says about it.
Would you, what are your feelings about the Anglo-Irish Agreement?
I would have liked a situation where no such agreement would have had to have come about, but I feel that it was quite clear that there was no real move forward. The British government had to take some kind of initiative. They did. The initiative was, I suppose, fairly characteristic of the style of government that we have in the United Kingdom at present, and was very unsatisfactory in many ways. But once it had come about, it was political reality, and the real question is not to complain and struggle and so on over the issue itself, but to say, how do we move forward from there? And I think that rather shrewdly, the possibility of a review process was included in the original agreement. We're looking forward to that coming up in November time, and I think it's a very good opportunity if people want to see progress. And I don't think anybody can look at the events of the last 6 months from any perspective and say it wouldn't be good to move forward from where we are in Anglo-Irish relations or in relationships within Ireland. the review gives a chance for that.
Well, what about, though, what was said recently by our Taoiseach, Mr. Haughey? He said that because the agreement was an international agreement, he, as Taoiseach of this country, would, of course, stand by it. But future progress with the Unionists was impossible in the context of the agreement, so he was suggesting a parallel move forward, which Geoffrey Howe dismissed as a fifth wheel on a perfectly made carriage. What do you feel about the possibility of advancing forward with the Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland as Unionists, parallel with the Anglo-Irish Agreement?
I'm not entirely sure just exactly what Mr. Haughey was meaning by that. I read the speeches in detail. I think there were some interesting comments in the speeches. I'm not just entirely clear what he was suggesting, and perhaps it may be possible to tease that out a little bit further as the next period of time goes on. What at least it does represent is the appreciation and an emphasis on the fact that Unionists must be part of any kind of moving forward. And if that is the particular thing that we can take out of his comments, then I think it's a helpful statement. If, however, what was being said was the only way forward is a unitary state, and the Unionists can say a little bit about what they would like within that, but there's absolutely no possibility of anything else, then I think that's making any kind of moving forward more difficult rather than less difficult. But I wouldn't like to make any immediate or rash judgments about it. It's an interesting comment, and I'm sure we'll see more coming from it.
Well, in the context of the bringing about of the agreement itself, what would you say to those people who, when Unionists complained that they weren't consulted, said, how can you consult with people whose entire vocabulary comprises the word no, or has heretofore comprised the word no?
Yes, I think that that's an understandable response. I would have some sympathy with it. But I think it would be very hard to make the argument that the Alliance Party would not have made a constructive response to any consultation or offer of consultations, and it didn't come. So that leaves me rather unconvinced of that particular argument. The other side of it is this: people must be offered consultation. If they refuse it, then they can't complain afterwards. If they don't get any consultation, and if they don't get any offer of consultation, then they do have some legitimate complaint, and certainly that whole area has undermined the possibilities for the Anglo-Irish Agreement in the Northern Ireland context itself.
What is so different? Here's another one coming up with these questions. What is so different, or what is the great difference, or are the great difference between the South and the North that make it impossible for us to be happy together? What's the difference between us?
I don't think there's a difference. I think there are many differences. I was commenting recently to some friends. I used to live near Moira, which is a little town, you may not even have heard of it, near Lough Neagh. And 1987 passed by with no reference to the 1350th anniversary of the Battle of Moira, which was a battle, it was the greatest battle ever fought in Ireland, believe it or not. And it was a battle between the men of Ulster and the men of the rest of Ireland. And the men of Ulster brought in their friends from Scotland to help them with the fight. Now, we didn't need a Reformation, we didn't need Presbyterians and Roman Catholics. The English had never thought of coming over here at that time. And we still, all on our own, found plenty of possibilities of fighting about it. Now, it seems to me, therefore, we've got to recognise that there is something there. It's a profoundly long duration. But surely, in the latter half, in the late part of the 20th century, when all the other major disputes within Europe are beginning to find a new context within the European community, surely we can begin to explore this most favoured possibility, a totality of relationships within a broader European context. And that whatever struggles and disagreements that there are, instead of coming out in violence and in killing, can come out in structures of a political kind, which make relationships possible.
What do you see as wrong with the belief that if Britain announced in the morning that she was actually pulling out of the north of Ireland over the next, say, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, whatever she would take out the first paper clip next Monday, and thereafter a reality in everybody's life, north and south, is that 10, 15 years hence, we will not be there, and you're going to have to solve your own problems. What is wrong with that?
I think the assumption that underlies that is that if Britain decided to move out, then although there would be a great hubbub, we'd be moving towards a united Ireland.
But you don't believe that.
I don't believe that for a minute. I think what we've been moving towards is a Western European Lebanon. Because there's no doubt whatever in my mind that not just amongst extreme loyalists, but amongst unionists, and even amongst people in my own party, people would begin to start looking very quickly towards an independent Ulster. That would very rapidly result in a bloody civil war, which would go on for generations. And it would not lead to a united Ireland, united even in land terms, never mind in hearts and minds. It would lead to a bloody civil war, possibly some form of repartition, which would not solve the problem of West Belfast and so on. And it really is a recipe for absolute disaster. I think it's attractive, but it's superficial, and it would lead to disaster, because we shouldn't forget, peoples are not bounded by land. The kind of relationship that has been over centuries and centuries between the people of the northeast of Ireland and the people of Scotland, for example, makes them as much one people, in fact, much more one people than, say, Ireland in total or Britain in total or whatever. People are not bounded by bits of land.
Do we not understand you up there? Do we down here not understand you? Is that a real problem for us?
I think it is, but it's no more a problem for you, I suspect, than that we don't understand you. And sometimes we think we understand each other. I think sometimes, for example, Northern Catholics think that they really are very close to Southern Catholics, and I think they're a lot further apart than they imagine. I think sometimes that people in the Protestant community think that they understand Catholics, and what they understand are their own bigoted myths which give comfort to them. I think over the last while in the Republic there has been some increasing realization of this, and I think that's been healthy. If it leads to a wish to accommodate without taking over, then that's very good and healthy. If it leads to a wish to turn away from it because it's just too horrible and horrendous, I don't think it really will make an enormous contribution.
Well, now, you didn't choose to follow your father into the ministry, though you are an elder of your church. You became instead, or you interested yourself in psychiatry instead, and you became a psychotherapist, which we don't have time to talk about at any great length, but I would be interested to know whether your years spent studying psychiatry have given you an insight into the particular problems of North of Ireland, denied people in other professions, perhaps. Well, what do you know about the Irish Catholics and Protestants because you're a psychiatrist?
I think it would be a little bit pompous to suggest that because of that, somehow or another, I had this profound understanding of the depths of the Irish psyche.
Well, insights, perhaps, rather than profound understanding.
I hope that it gives me some kind of ability to work with people and some possibility of understanding and moving forward. I hope it does give me that sort of contribution. In the same way as someone from a legal background will obviously have particular skills in understanding the kinds of constitutional mechanisms and so on. I think it's another contribution, and it seems to me that the problem is such a long and intractable one that we need to muster every conceivable human resource we have in order to see if we can make some kind of progress. I still work in psychiatry and in psychotherapy, so I've not left it behind. But I would hope that it would help to enrich and inform my approach to politics and perhaps to life in general.
Well, you did use the word intractable, and during our talk here, I haven't discerned a definite line for the future which you see as leading towards a resolution. Is there one? Do you know it? What is it?
When people start talking about solutions, the situation that always comes to my mind is that of the final solution, and I'm very chary of that. However, my experience of psychotherapy leads me to realize that we can find ways of accommodating in relationships, which are not a solution. Relationships always have to be worked at. Any marriage that feels it's got the solution is heading towards the rocks. And I'm utterly convinced that if we wish to, within Ireland, within the British Isles or the islands of the North Atlantic, within Europe, we have ways of developing relationships which, if we continue to work at, will work and will create the kind of free, fair, open, caring, peaceful societies, not society, but societies, communities, that we, I think most of us, want to see developing.
Dr. John Alderdice, thank you for talking to me.
Thank you very much.
There are lots of reasons to visit Wales, not least to see the beautiful landscape, but Face of the Earth came to see the